me, actually, because as I was preparing for this talk, submitting to Christ in conflict, all my students started coming to me, and I actually had to counsel almost every single one of them in every meeting I had this week on conflict. And so actually, as I was talking with them, they were helping me form my talk, because I was recalling all these things that I've experienced in my life and seeing what they're going through in their lives with real-time conflict. And so the things that I have to share with you tonight are largely coming out of my experiences being in conflict and being a perpetrator of a lot of conflict. I think I have been the most conflictual person on my staff team. Maybe they wouldn't say that's true, but I definitely have been in conflict. I've been the cause of conflict. I've been the recipient of conflict. So my whole life, I feel like, actually, on staff at least, has been about resolving conflict. And so it's something that I think Jesus is really, really passionate about. It's something that's a reality that we all have to deal with in community, whether it's in a group like ACIB or in a church or in your workplace or in your family. So it's a really, really good topic to talk about. And I certainly have not arrived at all the insight that I probably need to have before I go to heaven about how you do conflict well, but I definitely have learned things through a lot of my mistakes and through some successes. So I want to share those with you today. What I want you to do briefly is actually turn to someone next to you and share about a conflict. If you want to be really vulnerable, share briefly about a conflict that you're in right now, or share about a conflict that you've witnessed. Maybe you can talk about, like, my friend was in this conflict, and wow, it was bad. But just kind of to get your minds into this idea of conflict and the topic, share really briefly. So don't go into a whole, and then she did this, and then she said this, and then, but just kind of share briefly how you've experienced conflict in your life. I won't ask you guys to share the details of the conflict that you talked about, but I know, at least in my life, I've experienced conflict with roommates, with my parents, with my husband, with my students, with my coworkers, with my parents, with my in-laws, with people that I don't even know, that like cut me off on the road or something, get really mad. So conflict is all around us, and what I want to do briefly, if you go to the next slide, I wanted to use the schema of creation, fall, redemption very, very briefly in the beginning of this talk, just to talk about it through the lens of conflict. As I was reflecting, when you think back to the Garden of Eden, it's actually almost impossible for me, because of the fallen experiences I've had, to imagine a life that's conflict-free. But if you can imagine, back in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve had no sort of conflict with one another. They never got upset at one another. If they did, it was like a righteous anger. They never got mad at God. God never really got mad at them until sin was introduced. And so I think that we can establish the fact that conflict doesn't feel good. When we're in it, the yearning to get it resolved, or the yearning to at least just flee from it, or have something happen other than conflict, I think points to the fact that we weren't designed to be in conflict with one another. And that points even more so to the importance of it actually being resolved well. I think a lot of times, at least in my life, I've started to feel like conflict in my life with certain people is just the status quo. I don't know if you guys can relate with me, but there are certain people that God has created which I just can't stand them, or they always say something and it ticks me off. I'm sure I'm that kind of person to other people. And I think the temptation for me is to become lax about that, and to actually think that conflict is just never going to go away, that it's never meant to be overcome, and that it can't be overcome. And so what I want to actually do is say that God designed us to be in harmonious and peaceful relationships with one another. And so we really shouldn't settle for the fact that conflict is the status quo, or is going to be the norm in our life. I think that one of the biggest things I've seen in my life around the area of conflict resolution has been that it's been a channel, it's been something that God has used to bring profound sanctification into my life. So as I've entered into conflict, sometimes people have had to drag me, or conflict resolution, I have to say. Sometimes people have had to drag me into it because I don't want to resolve conflict. Sometimes I've been the one that's initiating it and been like, please, 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 we need to resolve this. Anytime I enter into the process of conflict resolution, God always teaches me something. He always sanctifies me. I come out of that process better than when I came in. Much more holy, understanding a lot more about myself, a lot more about that other person. And so I think that we can establish we were created to live in good and right relationships with one another. It can't be the status quo for us. The reality, and this is where we get, oh sorry, you can go to the previous slide.
The previous slide.
Yeah, there you go. We're still on the fall part. So the fall, I think, is that sin is introduced into the world. And so you think of the roots of conflict, the things that start conflict, maybe in your own life. For me, it's been pride, jealousy, my needs haven't been met, I have anger issues sometimes, I make mistakes, I do things unintentionally. Because of our brokenness, sin has been introduced into the world. Well, no, that doesn't make sense. Because of our brokenness, which is sin, conflict is released into the world. And we conflict with people for all different sorts of reasons. But what I want to say, and maybe this hopefully is not a wake-up call or a new idea to you, but conflict is actually inevitable. If any of you guys have ever been to the MAP training, Ministering Across Cultures, actually from some of my students in AIB, they said that they've never been in a conflict before in their life. And I was like, you are not telling the truth. You just didn't know you were in a conflict, but you've had conflict. And I think that especially as Asians, for those of you in the room who are from Asian backgrounds, I think that conflict's not something that's often talked about. It's something that's supposed to be pushed under the rug. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. You don't want to cause any kind of disagreement. You want to keep peace. So you just sort of swallow things. But I think something that can be freeing for us to all realize is that conflict is inevitable because we are sinful people. That's just inherently who we are. So conflict is going to arise out of that brokenness. Something I tell my students whenever I start discipling them, I really like to just kind of be upfront and just say, you know, you can expect that as a human being, even though I'm your staff worker, you can expect that I'm going to sin against you at some point in time in this discipleship relationship. It might be an overt kind of way. You're going to feel it and you're going to know it and you're going to say, ouch. Or it might be kind of a covert way. It's going to be, you're not even going to know it hit you. And I'm just going to sin against you. And it's going to take you a while to realize that I sinned against you. And then I tell them, you know, and because you're a sinful person, I can expect that you're going to sin against me. Because you're a broken person. And so that might be in obvious ways or not obvious ways. But I think that what we can expect from one another when we interact with everyone who's a broken person is that they are going to sin against you at some point in time. And I think realizing that helps conflict resolution. It ratchets it down a little bit. Because if you expect that it's going to come, and you know that it's something that's going to be able to be an opportunity for you to be sanctified, then it's a lot easier to enter into that process. It's not as scary. It's not as cosmic or like epic as it might feel. So I wanted to throw that out to you. I think a lie that we tell ourselves is that we can contain conflict. So if I have a conflict with one of my students, the lie that I tell myself is that this conflict is just between me and that student and no one else. But the reality that I've realized is that, especially when you're in Christian community, any conflict that you have with people becomes quickly a community issue and a community conflict. Partially because you're rooted in the community, also sometimes, unfortunately, because gossip starts happening, people start talking, and other people outside the immediate conflict are brought into that situation via gossip or consultation or mediation or whatnot. Something else that it's actually taken me quite a while to realize is that when I'm in conflict with someone else, it doesn't just affect me and it doesn't just affect that person, but it actually affects my relationship with God. This has been something that has been difficult for me to realize, and it's been sobering for me to realize. And it's been an impetus, a reason, and a motivation for me to actually resolve conflict better. Because the conflict that I have with other people on this earth dramatically affects my relationship with God. For the worse when I don't resolve it, for the better when I do resolve it. Matthew 5, 23, 24, this isn't on the slide. You'll recognize this verse. It says, "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar, first go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift." So something that I find really interesting about this is that God is commanding, Matthew 5:23, if you guys are looking it up, God is commanding, if you're going to go worship God, but then you remember that someone else actually has something against you, God is commanding you to first go and be reconciled with that person first, and then come offer your offering or your sacrifice to God. I think in this way, what God is saying is that he desires for us to be reconciled with each other in order that our worship to him would be pleasing. I'm thankful that this verse actually says, if you remember that your brother has held anything against you, go and be reconciled with them first. As someone who is a conflict avoider, probably by nature, by temperament, by default, I'm actually really thankful for verses like this, because what it's saying is, maybe I have something against someone else, but I haven't really been forthcoming, I haven't initiated that conflict resolution yet, but that person knows that something's going on. Like maybe I kind of give them the cold shoulder at large group. Like I walk by and I like say, oh hi, and I just walk by. And they can tell something's wrong, right? But I don't initiate, I don't say anything. What this verse is saying is if you sense that someone has something against you, that there's some kind of conflict between you two, that person who's sensing it actually needs to go and take the initiative to work out that conflict. So for all you conflict avoiders in the room, this is really freeing for us, because everyone who's a little bit more prone to resolve and be quick about conflict, it gets us off the hook for a little bit, because we don't have to initiate. The biggest thing I want to say here is that conflict, the presence of conflict, unresolved conflict, inhibits our worship of God. And I think that I found this to be true. And I'll go into a little bit more detail later on. But on the other hand, forgiveness of others ushers in personal forgiveness for us from God. That God actually delights and pleases, takes pleasure in when we actually reconcile and make peace with one another. So the title and the topic for today was submitting to Christ in conflict. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the cross. So the question I have, and I had to ask myself, is what difference does the cross make in conflict resolution? And I came up with a couple things, so I'm just going to list them off here. This is the redemption part, back still. So the redemption part, the cross, what difference does it make? Why does what Jesus did on the cross by dying in our place, what does that have to do with conflict resolution? How does that empower us? You can go back, actually, all the way to the redemption part still. We're still on that creation called redemption. Sorry about that. Yeah. It's a deceptive slide, because actually there's so many points, but it's just one slide.
Wait, is this it?
Yeah, this is it. This is it. What difference does the cross make? So one of the first things that I think is significant about the cross is that it is the primary way that we begin to comprehend how much God loves us. God sent his only Son into the earth to be an atoning sacrifice for us. The cross, the work that Jesus did on the cross, is the first way that we actually begin to comprehend that God loves us this much, that he would do this. I'm sure some of you have thought this before, but the cross actually satisfies the most cosmic conflict that we will ever be in. I don't know if you've thought about the gospel in this way, but we were actually in conflict with God before Jesus was sent and died on the cross. God created us to live in perfect relationship with him. When we decided to go our own way, when we decided to reject his leadership, that caused some kind of conflict. God was not happy. Just read about it in the Old Testament. He's not just an angry God in the Old Testament, but he was upset with the fact that we rejected who we were created to be. He was upset with the fact that we rejected him. And so Jesus, coming down into the world, into the earth as a man, fully God, what he did on the cross actually satisfies, it takes care of that conflict that we were in with God. And so I think that for us, it's actually helpful because our first, most primary conflict that we're in, as soon as we're born, gets satisfied through Jesus. In addition, the cross is where Jesus, who was sinless, became sin for us and undeservedly paid the penalty for the sake of our rebellion. And I think that this is significant, and hopefully I can share a little bit more about why it's significant. But because of what Jesus did, it actually enables us to love and to forgive people in a radical way. Because we are recipients of the most epic, that's my new favorite word recently, the most epic, the most wonderful, all-encompassing, beautiful and perfect kind of love and grace that we have ever received. We are the recipients of that. And if you've ever received an awesome gift from someone, it does something to your heart. When you receive something like that is totally undeserved, it makes you act in a different way. Or at least if you really understood what you've gotten, it makes you act in a different way. And I think that through Jesus' death on the cross, through his resurrection, it actually shows us the path of cross-shaped conflict resolution. And I think some of those things involve humility and service of others, putting the needs of others ahead of our own. If Jesus were really concerned about his own life, his own well-being, his safety, his comfort, there's no way he would have gone to the cross. He did it out of service, out of radical love. So this is just setting up an example. An example from my own life, so I briefly dated someone my freshman year. This person proved to be somewhat abusive, like emotionally and also physically, and also was really manipulative. I was just coming into my experience with Jesus. I was not a Christian yet, but through our friendship, did become a Christian. This person was not a Christian, and at the end of my freshman year, I had to make a decision that I was going to cut him out of my life because he was just not a good influence on me, and I was doing things I didn't want to be doing. And I remember I was at IVLI, which is a summer leadership InterVarsity training camp. I'm sure you guys have heard of it. And during one of my retreats of silence, I was really wrestling with forgiving this person. Because I hated him so much, he had done all these horrible things to me, and I was caught up in this cycle of hatred and this cycle of unforgiveness, and I didn't quite know how to overcome it. But I knew that I needed to get over it in some way, or else I was going to become consumed by this hatred. And so actually what was a turning point for me in actually forgiving him was that I started contemplating and reflecting on the fact that Jesus came to seek and save the lost. He came for the whole world. And what was life-changing for me in this process of forgiving him was realizing that Jesus didn't just come to save people like me. He came to save people like that guy as well. And actually, I wasn't even that much better off than he was. And so when I realized that Jesus' love and forgiveness and work on the cross actually extended beyond just the people that I liked, but he was actually able to receive that too if he wanted, that was radical for me. That freed me to actually forgive him and to love him, because I knew that someone greater than me, more holy than me, had actually already done that, was willing to do that. And that was the pathway in which I could begin forgiving him and reconciling with him. I think what is true is that those who judge harshly often feel judged themselves. So if you walk around life and you feel like everyone's judging you, you're going to tend to judge other people harshly as well in your own life. You're going to not want to extend grace to them because you feel like you have not been extended grace, if that makes any sense. But I think that the primary thing about the cross that enables us to do conflict resolution well is that because we have been loved so much, because we have been forgiven so much, because that forgiveness not only extends to us, but to the rest of the world, we're actually free to love in ways that we weren't humanly able to within our own confines and capabilities. Now you can go to the next slide. 1 John 4:19 says, "We love because he first loved us. If anyone says, 'I love God,' yet hates his brother, he is a liar. For anyone who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, who he has not seen. And he has given us this command: whoever loves God must also love his brother." And it goes on to say that love is one of the ways that we actually show who God is to the rest of the world. There's all these songs about love. I think love has been radically kind of misdefined for us now. Love is just sort of a lovey-dovey thing. But when you really think about what love means, what love looks like, it's a radical thing. It's a really amazing thing. So what I want to say to you guys is that if you are struggling to forgive someone, it might even be someone in this room. It might be someone here at MSU. If you're struggling to forgive them, one of the first places to start is contemplating the forgiveness that you have received in Christ. What I found is when I was least likely and most resistant to not forgive people in my life is because I hadn't actually internalized how much I had personally been forgiven by Jesus. And then in addition to that, chances are, if you're struggling to forgive others, there's probably more for you to comprehend about the forgiveness that Christ has extended to you. So that's where I want to land for this first part of the talk. I want to have you go back into your groups really briefly, and I want to ask you the question. You can go to the next slide. Why is conflict resolution difficult? This could be abstract, or this could be for you personally. Why do you not like to do conflict resolution? I don't want to be pessimistic, so if you really love to do conflict resolution, you can share about that too. But why is conflict resolution difficult? So go share really fast, and then I'll bring us back to it. Really, really difficult? What were some reasons that you threw out there? What'd you say?
Pride.
Pride, definitely. You hate to admit that you're wrong, or maybe you just always think that you're right. Yes. What else?
We talked about how more self-awareness after the end of the conflict.
Yeah, so like you might have to look at the harsh realities of yourself. Yeah, so things might come out in conflict resolution that you don't really like to hear. Like maybe it'd be like you were wrong, or you have this problem and you need to work on it, that kind of thing. Anything else? Conflict resolution is definitely not the easy road, right? Conflict resolution takes a lot of time. It probably takes lots and lots of extra conversations. You have to debrief everything, you have to share your feelings, you might have to cry a little bit. It takes tons of energy, right? I'll move on from there, but I think we can all agree, conflict resolution is really difficult. The realities of conflict resolution, it takes time, it's messy, and it's really hard work. Because you have to reach into who you are, what you've done. You've got someone else feeling like they can interpret and say exactly what you've done. You might disagree with them, so you have to take a harsh look at who you are and the things that have happened. You might have to apologize. You might have to try to work on something. There might be a consequence to you being in conflict. What I want to do is I want to go to the next slide. We're going to transition briefly, and I want to give you the anatomy of conflict. And this is coming from a book called Difficult Conversations. It's not a Christian book, but it's just generally an awesome book. And it's good for Christians, it's good for non-Christians, it's good for the rest of the world, I believe. It's an awesome, awesome book. Difficult Conversations. So they deconstruct what happens in a conflict. And it says that there are 3 levels of conversations that happen in any kind of conflict. So as I'm talking about this, get a little conflict that's happened in your life recently into your mind and start thinking about the conflict through these 3 lenses, these 3 conversations. The first conversation is the what happened conversation. So you hit me. That's the what happened. Or you stole money out of my desk when I wasn't looking. Or you cheated on me. Or you something, something, something. The what happened, the basic facts. And you'd be surprised, a lot of people actually disagree over the what happened conversation. That can be just a lot to talk about right there. The second level of the conversation is the feelings conversation. So when you hit me, that really hurt. You know, like I was feeling pain, I have a bruise, I was feeling rejected, I was feeling insignificant, I had a lot of feelings. When you stole my money, I felt like you were a bad person, or I felt gypped, or I felt whatever. So there's the feelings conversation. And something I want to say with this, and it's important, I'm saying this to myself as well, is that good intentions do not eliminate the possibility of hurt feelings. So essentially what I'm saying, when I say good feelings don't eliminate the possibility of hurt feelings, is that a lot of times in conflict, stuff happens, and when you actually sit down with the person, they say, well, I didn't mean to do that. Like, I didn't mean to actually hit you, or I didn't mean to call you a bad person, or I didn't mean to shame you in front of everyone in the room, or something like that. But the good intentions don't erase or negate the negative effects that it may have on someone and how they feel. So even though you might mean well, it doesn't mean that it might not cause a negative reaction on the feelings level for people. And I think oftentimes conflict can happen here because what we say to ourselves is, well, I just didn't mean anything wrong, so therefore what's the big deal? Like, why are you hurt? Just get on with it. I didn't mean to do it. Suck it up. Sorry. That kind of thing. The last one is the identity conversation. And for me, this kind of conversation in any kind of conflict, I think what I've experienced myself and in being in relationship with other people, questions start coming out like, does this situation mean that I'm incompetent or I'm competent? Does this mean that I'm loved or unloved by you? Does this mean that I'm a good person or a bad person? How does this affect who I think I am, or my self-esteem, or my self-image? This is the identity part of the question. Say you actually do shame a friend, maybe in a large group. Say it was unintentional. What happened is you said something, the feeling was I felt shame, and the identity question was I began to wonder if you were actually my friend, or I began to wonder if I meant anything to you, that kind of thing. For me, the identity question, asking myself every time I'm in a conflict with someone, what kind of identity issues have been raised through this conflict for that other person? What might they be wrestling with respect to their identity, and the way in which I might have called it into question in this conflict? 3 practical ways, and I'm going to move fast now through all these, 3 practical ways to submit to Christ in conflict. The first one is ownership. And this has been the one that has been most difficult for me, certainly, in all the conflicts that I've ever been in. And what I mean by ownership is basically taking ownership, accounting for the fact that you made a mistake and that you contributed to the problem. Acknowledging that you're broken and that you might have actually been more of a part of the problem than you actually thought you were. Matthew 7:3-5 says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?" Speck of sawdust versus plank in your own eye. How can you say to your brother, "Let me take that speck out of your eye," when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see more clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So a brief example, I was in a conflict with someone who is an authority over me. And I'm not going to get into the whole nuance of like Asians and conflict and hierarchy and authority and I'm not old enough and I'm younger and all that. But I was in significant conflict with them, and I felt like I was the victim. I felt like they were the older person. They should have protected me. They should have known better. I have high expectations of people who are in authority over me. You messed up, therefore you're the one that needs to take all the blame in the situation. But what I failed to realize is that in all my interactions with this person, I was actually coming across as super critical, super judgmental, very, very closed-minded, and I was actually provoking some of these things which I was taking a lot of offense over. So for me, it was really, really hard work in a situation where I felt like I was the victim, I was the one that was receiving all the wrongdoing, to actually take ownership over my role in the conflict. And what I want to say is that our default assumption in any kind of conflict is that we are always right and that other person is always wrong. Generally, that's going to go through your mind. Well, it wasn't me, it was just them. They had the problem. But it's rare in any kind of conflict that I've been in, that I've witnessed, that I've been part of mediating, it's rare that only one party is at fault. Generally, there are things on both sides for which each party could take ownership over and say, you know what, I did feel wronged here, but I can also take ownership over the fact that I contributed a little bit to what's going on. All right, the next thing is prompt and direct communication. And as I was reflecting on this, I realized that I'm speaking to a largely Asian community. Prompt and direct communication is not in our vocabulary because we are Asian and we do passive-aggressive conflict style, we avoid, we send emails, we don't talk directly to people. Let me just say a short thing on emails, really, it's not the best way to communicate if you have a conflict with someone. Just try it and you'll see what happens. So Ephesians 4:25-27 says, "Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to his neighbor, for we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold." So, I had a student, and he was actually studying a really interesting thing. He was studying the positive effects of ruminating in conflict resolution. And what I want to say here is a short disclaimer. There can be really great aspects to the Asian style of conflict resolution. Waiting, taking your time, sitting on something, talking to everyone else in the community except for that one person that you have conflict with. Those can work out sometimes. I've tried probably all those things, and for me, they don't work out so well. So what I want to submit to you is actually, I think there are times that we are called to do actually what the Bible calls us to, and take off our Asian identity and say there might actually be a better way. The Asian way might not be the best way in some cases. There might be a need to use discernment and exercise some kind of wisdom and say, maybe I do need to do more of a passive-aggressive kind of offhand approach. But I want to submit to you another way of doing it, which I acknowledge will be uncomfortable and probably foreign, maybe to some of you guys. But for me, it's been very, very helpful as someone who's passive-aggressive, who's exhibiting basically all the characteristics of Asian style of conflict. The verse in Ephesians says, put off falsehood. So what I see a lot of the times in conflicts that I mediate, or in conflicts that I have been in personally, is that we don't speak promptly to the people that we are in conflict with. And by doing that, we are actually putting up a falsehood, a false face to them every time we interact with them and we tell them that we're doing okay. I don't know if you guys can relate with me on this or not, but I think that in not addressing conflict promptly, sometimes we are being false to those that we're in conflict with because we're not actually telling them what's on our mind. It says, put off falsehood, speak truthfully. This goes without really needing much explanation, but I think it's a lie when we tell ourselves that loving people means not going to them and telling the hard thing. For me, what I found is that love sometimes actually looks like telling people the hard thing or receiving hard words. That is actually what love is. It's not withholding that observation or that thought or that feeling or that experience, but it's actually telling them. That is the greatest form of love. Engaging immediately. So something that I've heard to be part of a staff team culture or a group culture is simply say ouch when it hurts. If I pinch you, you're going to go ow. So as soon as something happens that doesn't feel right, actually nipping it in the bud and saying, hey, that hurt a little bit. The image that I want to leave you or kind of give you is a seed of bitterness. And for me, this is a really powerful imagery in my mind. But when something happens to you that you experience as conflict or that you don't like, a seed of bitterness is planted in your heart against that person. When you don't resolve that conflict with them, that's the water on that seed, the nutrients going into that seed, saying, grow, seed of bitterness, grow. And it does, and eventually that seed of bitterness actually becomes a root of bitterness. And for all of you who maybe have gardened before, it's really hard to pull out a big root. It's easy to pluck little seedlings, but it's really, really hard to pull something out after it's been watered and festered and fostered for a really, really long time. So that's why engaging immediately sometimes is a more helpful thing because it's easier to do things when they're small as opposed to when they've blown up and become huge and catastrophic. There's danger, this passage says, because the devil actually gets a foothold when you don't act immediately. And a foothold is defined by a secure place where further progress may be made. So when you don't act promptly with people, you don't tell them, that really hurt, you actually are giving a foothold for more bitterness, more conflict to enter into your relationship. The last thing I want to talk about is forgiveness. And I want to just leave you with a simple quote. It's not in the PowerPoint, but it's easy enough to remember. I heard it at a Veritas forum this past fall. The quote simply goes like this: unforgiveness is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. So I'll dissect that really briefly. Not forgiving someone is basically like you swallowing poison and saying, I hope that person dies over there. What this quote is saying is when you don't forgive people, when you store up bitterness in your own heart, it ends up affecting you the most. You actually get swallowed up by it. You get eaten up by it, and it leads to a spiritual death. Hopefully not a physical death, but certainly a spiritual death. But ironically, you're asking that other person to die by swallowing the poison yourself. The rewards of healthy conflict resolution: increase self-knowledge. You learn a lot about you, like Denise said. You understand others more. You understand what they were thinking, why they do things. And you have shalom. You have a wholeness, a peace in your community because you've actually taken care of stuff that needs to be taken care of. So what I want to do is I want to close by actually reading to you a parable. So you can close your eyes or you can just meditate on it. The parable is from Matthew 18, 15 through 35. And you all know Matthew 18 is the classic passage that talks about conflict resolution. So go back and read that if you want. But this is the parable that follows immediately after. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. The servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay you back.' But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. 'You wicked servant,' he said, 'I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?' In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart." So I don't want to end on a sour note, but Scripture is really, really strong about our call to forgive. And if you don't hear anything except this, hear this tonight, that God has forgiven you an enormous debt, a debt that you cannot pay back, a debt that you might not even fully comprehend until you get to heaven. Because you have been recipients of that kind of forgiveness, that kind of canceled debt, or you have that kind of forgiveness extended to you and available to you, that makes forgiveness of other people so much easier because you have been forgiven yourself. So you can go to the next question, last slide. So a couple things to leave you with. We won't spend time really talking about it, but think about it. To what extent have you received forgiveness from God? To what extent do you understand that? Do you realize that? Do you lean into that? Does that shape who you are and what you do? And then who do you need to seek forgiveness from? And whom do you need to extend forgiveness to? I'm sure in a room like this, there's probably conflict going on. I know there's conflict in my own life, conflict in AIB, there's conflict in the world. And so hopefully this talk tonight gave you some things to think about, some tools for entering conflict. And if you're actually sitting there feeling really convicted or really guilty, that might not be a bad thing. If someone's name or face has just been popping up into your head throughout this whole conversation, and you're like, "Ugh, really? Do I have to go talk to that person?" The answer is probably yes. It's going to be very, very difficult, but I think that you're freed because of what Christ has done for us. So let me pray, and then we'll continue the rest of the